we've got refreshments. Will there be a question time at the end as well?
I think probably if we just mingle around, we can ask questions as we sort of.
Now, if there is an evacuation, please follow my instruction. There's evacuation point there and there, and also toilets are up in the back far corner. But I think that we'll start this session tonight, but we're going to have an introduction by Lionel, who actually comes every Tuesday for our genealogy class. So if you ever want to do more of your family history, please come along on Tuesdays from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Yeah, so Lionel.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. As the lady said, my name's Lionel. I do family history volunteering at the library every Tuesday, so if you want to know something else, come along. I'm also a member of the Fellowship of First Fleeters, which is today's program. Now, Julie will be our first presenter doing her family, and each of them will do about 12-15 minutes or so. And my connection is one that Roger's going to do from a man called John Randell, who was one of Australia's first black settlers, which not a lot of people know about. Anyway, so I think we'll start and we'll get Julie on the way. Thank you.
So before we start, can everyone hear okay? Do we need to use the microphone? Yes. Alright, well look, if you feel you really can't hear, just put your hand up and then we'll have to activate this, okay? Nice and happy. No, you've got your
If you can't hear,
so that's great.
and they'll use a microphone.
Point of order.
They use it too.
I'll point. Yeah, just point, but don't touch the screen. Because it's
Hello, I'm Julie Aiken, and this is my family history. Now, I started doing family history in 1970 when my father died, and I didn't know where his parents came from. They'd been long dead. And in those days, family history was a little bit trickier than it is now, a lot trickier. We used to write lots and lots of letters. We'd get something oblique and absolutely obscure like the phone book, which had all our names in. We'd write lots of letters to all these people who had the same surname as we did. Send out your letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and if you got one back, that was fabulous. Most times you didn't. It was slow, it was very slow. And also, because my father's family, one was a Geordie, one was a Swede, it was hard going. I didn't speak Swedish. They weren't using the names they were born with. Too hard, switched to mum's side. She kept saying, all my family were born in Australia, so it's easy. So I thought, okay, that's fine. So we started with mum's family. We got back as far as her great-grandmother. Here she is, Matilda Plunkett. And Matilda, I'm sorry, it's out of alignment from what my computer did, but we'll handle that. This baptismal certificate showed us that her parents were Edward and Susanna Plunkett. Odan, didn't give me her name. Never mind, we moved on a little bit and we found her mother's marriage certificate. So Edward Plunkett married Susanna Thompson. So
Don't touch the screen.
the screen, Julie. Right, we'll learn. So because this didn't give me much, I went on to have a look for some more information. And in those days, it was a matter of going to your local library, looking at microfiche, which we probably still do now and again, and also microfilm. You had to learn how to use the machinery, the equipment, and so on. Most times you were lucky enough to get somewhere. Sometimes you just spend hours having a lot of fun looking at stuff that really didn't help. So painstaking work. Eventually I found, through getting Susanna's death certificate, I found her parents. And they were William Thompson, who was a hotel keeper, and Sophia Chipp. Right, let's see what we can find with them. Let's see if we can find their marriage certificate. Ah, marriage certificate. Sophia and William told us when they were married, where they were married. Not a clue as to where they came from. So some certificates, and it depends what year it was as to what the information is that's on that certificate, but eventually we got it. And after all, I'd now gone back 5 generations anyway, from me to my mum, her father, his mother, back to Susanna, and to Sophia and William. And you'll note, if you can see it there, Sophia was born in Sydney. So I had 5 generations that were in Australia. Obviously, her parents were in Australia. So I plodded along for a while, I couldn't find anything. And then out of the woodwork came this distant cousin who knew everything. And she told me that Sophia's father was Thomas Chip and he'd come in on the First Fleet. Well, she wasn't hardly credible. She'd already told my mother that those people weren't her parents, that was. So I thought, well, I better check this out myself. We eventually got somewhere and found that, damn it, she was right. Sophia Chip was the 6th child of Thomas Chip and Jane Langley. Now, they both came in on the First Fleet. So I had 2 First Fleeters. Wow! That was sweet. Now, let's find out who they are. First of all, Thomas Chip.
Speak up a bit,
Speak up a bit.
please.
Oh, sorry. Thomas Chip was a mariner on the Friendship, which was one of the 11 ships of the First Fleet. Jane was a tambour worker. She had done an apprenticeship and was working in beautiful embroidery work, which obviously was only affordable by the very rich, but she was making a nice little living out of that. Sadly, there was an old drunk around one night and he lost his money and thought he'd blame our Jane. So Jane was charged with grand larceny for stealing 5 guineas, 5 shillings, 5 pounds. And she was sent before the Old Bailey. Now there she was charged with grand larceny, which is anything over stealing 1 shilling was called grand larceny. And she was sentenced to death. She was immediately sent next door to the Newgate prison, there to await her fate. But in those days, in 1776, there were over 200 crimes on the statute book that were punishable by death. Grand larceny was one of them, down here, which is hard to see, I'm sorry, grand larceny. 43.5% of those who were sentenced to death were executed in the 1780s. And 35.8% had their sentence commuted to transportation. Fortunately, Jane's sentence was commuted to transportation beyond the seas for a period of 7 years. And she was one of the first 50 women to be marched out of Newgate prison to board the Lady Penryn, another of the ships to go on the First Fleet. And she went there on the 1st of January 1787. Sadly, the First Fleet didn't leave till the 13th of May. So from the 1st of January to the 13th of May on board a ship, my Jane found a sailor. And she managed to get herself pregnant. Goodness. Imagine it. Now this child was born on the journey out to Australia, and here's a copy of the ship's log. It says the Lady Penryn, Cape of Good Hope, and 4th of November, which was the date that the log entry was made. And it says here, Henrietta Shirring, daughter of daughter of Philip Shirring and Jane Langley, convict, born October the 22nd. Now that was just before they came into Cape Town on the journey out. Let's have a look at that journey. They left Portsmouth went down through bad storms to Tenerife. There they spent 7 days repairing sails and so on, taking on more stores. Then they went down to Rio de Janeiro, where they spent a month waiting for the ships to be repaired and taking on more stores again. Headed across then to the Cape of Good Hope. Once again, another month they spent there taking on stores, repairing the ships, and they took on a lot of extra stock, horses, cattle, sheep, geese, pigs, whatever, ready to start the new colony. So, this is Portsmouth Harbour about the time that the First Fleet left. Very busy, but very basic. Down here we see in Portsmouth Harbour a whole lot of prison hulks. Now the hulks were old disused ships that no longer sailed. They were moored and used as prisons because the prisons were overcrowded, which was the reason they were sending convicts out. Had been going to America, now they wanted to send them to a new colony. But there were hundreds moored in Portsmouth Harbour. Today, they don't use Portsmouth Harbour, they use Southampton, and my husband and I just were lucky enough to board the Queen Elizabeth at Southampton in 2019 and travelled a very similar route. We wanted to experience that same route. So we went down to Tenerife, cut across to Cape of Good Hope, and via Mauritius and Reunion, we went to Fremantle that way. Now the reason we could go through here is pretty basic. They had to call in at Rio in those days because this is known as the doldrums. There was no wind, and sailing ships needed wind. Apart from that, there was no British colony on the west coast, and so they couldn't stop there anywhere, and there were pirates in that area. We never met any pirates. They're over here in Somalia these days. So we took that route. Now, find where I am. The first stop we made was Tenerife, and this is Tenerife today. It's in the Canary Islands. It's a Spanish set of islands, and we went over those mountains in the bottom left picture, over to Santa Cruz, and there we visited a garden, and this garden was started in 1790, just 2 years after the First Fleet went through there. We actually saw a tree that had been planted in 1790, which was really special. From there, we went down, straight down to Cape Town. Now, down the bottom here, oh, okay, sorry, it looks a little different. When the First Fleet went to Cape Town, Philip and his officers went ashore and were entertained by the governor of Cape Town in this complex here, known as the Castle of Good Hope. You went in through this gateway here, which is that gateway on the left, exactly the same today. That's my photo over there. From there, they went through here, over the cobblestones to this building in the centre, and that's the one there. And we were just so chuffed to be able to go into this same building where Captain Arthur Phillip and his officers were entertained. It was really special. So moving from there, we go back to Jane on the Lady Penrhyn. Now the Lady Penrhyn was built on the River Thames in 1786 as a slave ship. It would hold 275 slaves, but it was chartered for the First Fleet to hold 102 women prisoners on the Lady Penrhyn, ready for the new colony. So the whole fleet of 11 arrived in Sydney Cove 5 or 6 days after they had landed at Botany Bay. Found it most unsuitable because they couldn't unload their stock, their people, their supplies. There was just nowhere to land them. So they found a little place up further on the coast and went into Sydney Cove. Now, excuse me. at the time when the first fleet landed, everything looked fairly rosy. It didn't take many weeks later before, within a short time, they were very, very short of food. And after a while, the decision was made to send the convicts and some settlers to Norfolk Island. So off they went to Norfolk Island, where there was a lot of fish, there was fresh fruit and vegetables could be grown, the weather was better, the cultivation was a lot better than it was in Sydney. And it was here that Jane Langley met Thomas Chipp. She may have met him in Sydney, we don't know, but there is a belief in the family that he followed her to Norfolk Island. And there they were married in a mass ceremony on Norfolk Island on the 5th of November 1791. And the ceremony was performed by the Reverend Richard Johnson, who had over 100 couples in that ceremony. Sadly, the paperwork didn't make it back to Sydney, so we have no record, but there's a lot of books written, stories, diaries and that sort of thing that tells us this is what happened. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Chipp stayed on the island, had 2 children there. They were cultivating a crop, and the produce they made from that they sold back to the stores, so they were making a good living. And sadly, their 2 children died. They're buried on the island. Alec and I went there in 2013, but we couldn't find any record of where the children were buried. So, very short time later, they decided, the powers that be decided, that it was too costly to keep Norfolk Island going. It was too far away, too costly as a penal settlement. So they were going to relocate everybody back to Van Diemen's Land. Now, Thomas didn't want to go to Van Diemen's Land. He wanted to go back to Sydney. And he was a mariner. He was not subject to their instructions. So he took his wife and they went back to Sydney. And they were given several grants of land and made a very comfortable living from the land. And they produced another 5 children. And Jane died on the 19th of February, aged 74. And Thomas died in 1842, aged 88. I'm sorry, when you put it on a different computer, everything moves. But the story doesn't end there. Family history doesn't end there. Remember I told you about Sophia Chipp, and she had this husband, William, who had a hotel. He was a hotel keeper. Wow. He actually came into the colony as a convict. He was a highwayman. And he did a little bit of bush ranging when he got here. Then he went into the hotel business and died a very respectable gentleman. And once again, family history repeats itself. My other three great-great-grandparents did much the same. Charles Roberts married Emma Terry. They had 10 children. He died in 1910. Oh no, he didn't. We recently found out he died in 1855, in April. So, where did the other children come from? Emma, a merry widow, met a very charismatic Irish sailor. And we know that his name was Francis Delahunt. We know that Francis Charles was actually his child. We're assuming that Catherine and the other child, William, were his children as well. So, dear old Emma, she met this serial bigamist who had little families all over the world. She had 3 children to him. Great heritage. At least one of the children. And he left for Sydney, and she took the young children. She got on a ship and she followed him. She died there. She's buried in Rookwood Cemetery. And then we had Thomas Lewis Bassett. He married Mary Ann Munday, and her parents came in from Oxfordshire in 1842. We knew all about her. Couldn't find his name on any passenger list, any convict list. There was no Thomas Lewis Bassett. But convict he was. Peter Lewis, his name was. Now, why didn't I know that? So family history is never really finished. As a matter of fact, Some 177 years later, once again more family history, wow factors, never-ending story. 177 years after the first fleet, they were found a piano which came out on the first fleet. It was a square piano, and it was hidden in the laundry of a family who wanted to sell it to buy a washing machine. So it was bought by this gentleman here, Stuart Simons, who collected historic pianos. And he was getting on, as you can see. He sold it to the he donated, I beg your pardon, to the West Australian Academy of Performing Arts, the Edith Cowan University, and it is now, it's been back to Bath to be restored, and it's used by the students who are learning historic music. So it's never really finished. And this is actually what it...
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. Oh, I had a little sound.
Go back.
No, not to worry.
You touch the screen maybe.
I don't think it'll work. Ah. Not going to play.
Push it along.
Don't worry, they've had enough. I'm over time.
Who's next?
Ah, this one. Judy, is it?
Absolutely. Yes.
You're going to talk forever. Who's doing that?
Just playing.
Most of the research. Yeah, she just loves
My name's Roger, and I'm speaking on behalf of my first leader wife, twice over. Lionel mentioned John Randall. We pronounce it, or I'm from England. John Randall. That's how I would pronounce it.
Can we have a little more volume, please?
More volume.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Yeah. And yeah, Veronica's great grandfather, 4 times over. There's Veronica, and me. That's her father. Oh, that's the screen. Her father. Mother there, back here, and we're going to talk about John Randall here. So, who was John? We are indebted to Cassandra Bybus, who's produced a book about the 11 black people who came on the first fleet. And so most of this information comes from there. Where was John born? We believe he was born in Stonington in Connecticut, which is halfway between New York and Boston. And we had the date there, didn't we? 1764. His parents were West Indian, supposedly. Maybe they were from Madagascar. His name came from the owner of he was a slave, so the owner of the property, who was Randall, and then they tacked on John or Thomas Randall, so he was John Randall, slave of Mr. Randall. And then came the War of Independence in America, and the British they weren't doing very well, so they decided that they would enlist the slaves, and in return they would emancipate the slaves who were enlisted with them. So John thought this was a good idea and joined up. He had certain attributes. He could play the drum and the tambourine. And then the war came to the end. His regiment went back to England, and the war paid off, and he was emancipated. The only trouble was that the white ones, they got a pension. But John, he was a slave, he got nothing. So what did he do? He stole. And if you steal, you go before the magistrate. And as we've seen from Julie, he gets 7 years. And what does he do? He goes on the hulk. This one's in the Thames. These hulks were dreadful things. Imagine being in the Thames where we just had cold, wet weather now. Imagine being on a hulk squeezed in and horrible food and things. Pretty nasty. Anyway, he was transferred to the Alexander, and you've seen that picture before. So off he went on the round trip to sunny Australia. And I've got 258 days. I think Julie had 262. Anyway, 258 days. He arrived in Sydney, and the first thing he did was to marry Esther. It was the first marriage in the colony, and she had a bad time. She came out on the Lady Penryn, and she'd been stealing as well. She died in childbirth in 1783, and that's where she's buried. It's George Street. That's where the original cemetery was in Sydney. Then he married Mary Butler, and she also stole. She stole a basket containing 9 pecks of French beans. And she was sentenced to the Old Bailey, and say that came out on the Neptune. Now the second fleet, they had a real hard time. The first fleet, Captain Phillip was in charge, and he tried to get everybody to the colony, because he knew when he got to the colony, he'd need as many people as possible. On the second fleet, they were paid for the people who came, who boarded the ship, not who got off the ship. And so consequently, they were pretty well starved to death. Not many arrived. When they did arrive, they had to carry them off the ship. Anyway, life with Mary, married Mary, and they had 4 children. And here we see Francis Randall, which is the one that Veronica's related to. He became a farmer, and because he'd done his 7 years by 1792, and he was given land, given 60 acres, 30 acres because he was entitled to it, 20 more acres because he had a wife, and 10 more because he had 1 child at that stage. And that's where his farm was. The screen. We've got Sydney here, Parramatta there, so up there is where his farm. He sold his farm because he thought he'd do better in the army, because he'd been in the army, he knew all about it, but he needed someone to tell him, to put a good word forward to him. So for £10 of that 40, that person put a word forward to him, and he joined the 80 regiment. He was a bandsman, and he's described here as 44 years old, black complexion, and 5'9". And he served for 10 years. During that time, he came across Fanny, new partner. They possibly had 4 children, we don't know exactly. And after he was discharged, he became a policeman doing the night rounds, just making sure everybody did the right thing. And then in 1813, he had a farm again. We know this because in the Sydney Gazette it says, to be sold on Friday next, the 23rd inst, at 12 noon at the house inhabited by John Randall at Kissing Point, sundry household furniture and utensils, and 4 or 5 acres of growing corn was said to be sold to the highest bidder. And by that time, that's where Kissing Point is in Sydney, Parramatta. So, what became of John? We don't really know. Some of the books say that he went to Tasmania. we just don't know. However, I came across this picture and we wondered if that was John. Heading up the band, he knew all about the band. And, you can't see his complexion, but he looks very happy there leading them on. So, we had John, his daughter comes down there, Veronica's father, Veronica, and me. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a sixth generation direct bloodline descendant of Nathaniel Lucas and Olivia Gascoigne, and this is the family crest that was developed a long while back and is still known in the family. Now, this family has grown to about 80,000 with bloodline to this pair. Both convicts. And I'm going to use a different approach to perhaps both Roger and Julie that I've not so much on the history, but because you've seen the route that they came out on, you've seen the ships. I'm going to concentrate more on, after doing my research, and whereabouts they were, I decided to follow their footsteps. So I've taken a series of photographs of places where they have stood and worked, and I'm going to show you those more than historical pictures. I've got a little bit of background on each of them. Olivia lived in Worcester, in England, and she was a housemaid to a reasonably wealthy family in Worcester, and she was thought that she was being underpaid by the owner of the property. She decided with a couple of friends that they would steal money from her employer. It was six guineas, which was a huge amount, and that attracted the death penalty because of the amount, and it was a theft under arms. So whether that was a gun or whether it was just a big lump of wood, I don't know what. Yes, each of them is regarded as a weapon. So she was sent for 8 months pending trial to Newgate Prison, and when she appeared in 1784 before the judge in Worcester, she was sentenced to death. Now, it was usual in those days that they would try and have about 6 trials in the morning, and then those that were sentenced to death, they'd hang them in the afternoon.
No appeal.
On this particular day, it was the judge's last day on the bench, and so he decided to commit the women, because they were all women that were judged that day, to he would give her a little bit of sympathy, and he turned it into 7 years transportation. So Olivia was lucky to be here, and if she hadn't been here, I don't know who I would be or where I would be. So I've got okay. This is the house where she worked. So I did we had to travel all over the world to find places where they were. Fortunate part is that there's a book written by a fellow in Worcester on the 8 women that were convicted and came on the First Fleet, of which Olivia was one. I was able to locate him in Worcester, and he arranged for me to meet the people who owned this house. It's a place called Seven Stoke, just outside of Worcester, and it looks as though I only own one shirt. So we were able to, the people who owned this house and which incidentally, it's 300 years old, this house. And we were able to go inside, and they had a box that had been passed down from owner to owner over the years that recorded lots of information that they thought may have been myths. So they were rather excited to meet me because I was able to give them a lot of history about the fact that Olivia was there at this property. You know that for a fact. And so it's a little bit dark, but this is the room where the crime took place. And so it was quite moving to be standing in the same room. Probably not a fancy staircase like that at the time, but it was but this was actually the house. Then this is the inside of the courtroom. Once again, it was quite dark in there. But the courtroom is in the what do they call them in England? Where the Lord Mayor and the council sits. The Guildhall. It was the Guildhall in Worcester, and it is still the courthouse, the same courthouse where she appeared in 1785. So that was quite moving, and the witness box was in the same position, or the accused, with the accused in the same position, but not the same piece of timber was it made from. This is also inside the courthouse, and you'll see up there, in case of fire, there's all the buckets up there. So they fill up with water to try and put the fire out. This is the author of the book. He was with me that day, and we decided, he told me that only a few years before he wrote the book, they found that under the guild house there was actually tunnels with cells where the people were held pending them coming up to the court. So it was underneath the guild house, and they didn't know that until just a few years ago. All the records have been lost, so they've now been opened. This is standing in the tunnel leading to the cell. That one was taken in the cell. I'm sorry that it's sort of dark, but that's what the cell looked like. And there was all they would have had in there was a candle for light. And she would not have spent a lot of time there. It was probably only came in from prison on the day and expected to be executed in the afternoon, but she went back to the prison. This thing was inside the prison that she was actually held in, because the records are there. There was only 2 cells, and she was in there with another woman called Anne Inett. I'm not sure it was Inett or Inett, who also came out on the first week with her. They were in prison in Worcester together, and they became great friends. They went to Norfolk Island together on the same ship. Her friend Anne Inett then got into a relationship on Norfolk Island with the Commandant, Philip Gidley King, who later became the Governor of New South Wales. She had 2 children by him, so because she was in with the Governor, both she and her husband Nathaniel were actually quite looked after. And this is leading from the tunnels at the bottom. There was a narrow circular staircase that led up straight into the accused box. So I was able to walk up that same set of stairs, and when you appeared at the top, you were standing inside the accused box. Okay, now I'll tell you a little bit about Nathaniel Lucas. Of course, they didn't know each other at the state, but Nathaniel was the son of a carpenter, and his father had taught him all the carpentry skills, and he had plenty of work. He was doing work in London at the Red Lion Hotel in Holborn, and he was accused of stealing some clothing. Now, he always says he's innocent, and I suppose that's natural, but his innocence might have been justified, because when, at this stage, they were putting together the idea of a colony to send these convicts to, Captain Arthur Phillip was actually around putting this together for some time, and he wanted tradesmen. He didn't want to take a whole heap of people to Australia, without any skills, because he was going to do all the work to build. And so they made sure that they were able to attract or get these people by making accusations, getting them convicted, and then they'd be on the ship. So Nathaniel sort of fitted that mould. He was put into the Ceres, which was a hulk on the Thames, and he spent about 3 years in the hulk before the fleet left. He was convicted in 1784 and 1787 before the first fleet left. So he came on the Scarborough. Now this is a model of the Scarborough which is in the Sydney Museum, and it was the second largest transport of the fleet. It was quite a large ship. Only male convicts on this one. There's a picture there of the Lady Penguin. Model of the Lady Penguin, which you've heard a lot about because everyone seems to come on that. This was females only. And it was regarded as the worst sailor in the fleet. So they were all seasick. This is the arrival in Sydney Cove, a painting, drawing and if you look at this, they're heading into where Circular Quay is now in Sydney. And up behind that would be George Street, Pitt Street, and the city of Sydney today. They'd only been in Sydney Cove, or they called it Port Jackson in those days. The word Sydney hadn't been developed as a name for the place. They'd been Port Jackson, and within 2 weeks they had decided that this wasn't going to be able to sustain all of the 1,500 people who were there for convicts and the Marines, and that they would need to find somewhere else more fertile to be able to grow crops. And Captain Cook had left some information that Norfolk Island was very fertile, and so they chose the Supply, which is one of the ships, to take 23 people to Norfolk Island. And they left only 2 weeks after the 26th of January, so at the end of February. Early February, they were on their way to Norfolk Island, and they decided to take people that had been very well behaved amongst the convicts, and both Nathaniel and Olivia were amongst them. So of the 23, there was 6 female convicts, 9 male convicts, and there was then 7 freemen and Philip Gidley King, who was the commandant of Norfolk Island. So off they went. They got there at the end of February, I think the 28th of February, and it was, so it's around 1,800 kilometres. They found then that very difficult to land on Norfolk Island, and it took them 5 days to find the right weather conditions to be able to bring the ship, the small boat, off the ship to get onto the island. On the way, Nathaniel and Olivia decided they were pretty keen on each other, notwithstanding that Nathaniel had a wife in England. I'm going to read you some here. So I've got this is the ship's log of those who were on the Lady Penguin. There are several pages of that, of course. But Nathaniel is a few from the top there. It shows her name, her crime, and occupation, and how many years she got. So she got 7. She was lucky she didn't get 14. This is an extract from the diary or the journal of Arthur Bowes. Now, he was the surgeon on board the Lady Penguin, and he wrote this, which is quite interesting, and I'm not sure, you probably can't read that, but it says so Arthur Bowes was writing this, and I think he's referring to Arthur Phillip. He also informed them that it was the governor's pleasure that if any partiality or reciprocal affection should take place between the male and female convicts going there or after their arrival at Norfolk, they might marry. And that he, this is, when he's talking to he there, he's talking about the fellow named Jamison, who was the surgeon that went with them. He's authorised the surgeon, Mr. Jamison, that office, and after a time, the clergyman may be sent there to remarry them. The names, and then he went on to say, the names I recommend and who consented to go were Elizabeth Lee, Elizabeth Hipsley, Elizabeth Colley, Olivia Gascoigne, and Anne Inett. So they chose, before they left, they chose who the best behaved women were. So great-great-granny must have been a good girl.
She got there.
Holding up and stealing a bit of money. When you get to Norfolk Island, this is a plaque that we found there. This was only put there in 1970 by some historical group, but it just sort of records the number of people that went there. This goes way back as a record of who those 23 were. And you'll see Olivia and Nathaniel amongst that lot. So the 7 free settlers there was a surgeon, there was a chief constable, and people like that. Probably a couple of servants for the commandant. And they then quickly started to grow crops there, and they were actually sending them back to Sydney. It was interesting that after they left to go to Norfolk Island, they decided to call Port Jackson Sydney as a place, and then when Philip Gedley King got to Norfolk Island, he decided to call the capital of Norfolk Island Sydney. Neither of them knew that each of them used the same name, so it was a bit confusing. There was 2 cities. After they had settled in and started farming, Nathaniel was given land, and this was his first piece of land that he was given. It was 15 acres, right in the centre of Sydney town, near the government house. And anyone been to Norfolk Island? Okay. You might be in a Quality Row, which was a lovely set of houses along quite a long street. And his property was right next to all of those. So he was doing quite well. He was still a convict at this stage.